Por favor, atención.
Atención.
Atención, por favor. Okay. So, my great pleasure to actually introduce Fernando and introduce Martha. But to let you know, this is the last lunch forum. So from now on, every 2 weeks, you'll have to buy your own lunch. You know that this is usually a forum for our faculty, but also for students. We've occasionally had students present here. Think about it for the fall. Anyone here would like to, either yourself or a couple of you, propose a forum for next fall? You should do it. It's a chance to bring out your best ideas and expose them in an audience and get used to presenting them and so forth. So we're real open to that. We have a big announcement today, which is actually an announcement for Monday at 4 p.m. In Goldsmith Courtyard. There'll be a reception and a bargain buying of the latest issue of Center. Center 21, I don't know if most of you might remember The Secret Life of Buildings, all those weird objects around the school. Here they all are. So with the lectures by Graham Harmon and Patrick Schumacher has a gigantic essay in here with a reply from Graham Harmon. So you can see these two guys battling it out in these pages. There's even an essay by me and by Corey. I think this is going to be a landmark edition of Center 21, and it's super, super beautiful. So come by on Monday, bring friends. This really is a landmark thing for us. So with
Who
that,
edited it, Michael?
me and Corey edited it. Okay. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Fernando, who's going to introduce Marco.
Thank you, Michael. Let me stand up just to follow what Michael Benedict always does. It's been a pleasure to have Marcio Cotrim here with us. He's a visiting scholar from Universidade Federal da Paraíba in Brazil, where I have been collaborating with them, invited by Marcio for many, many years. It's a fantastic graduate program if you ever have the chance to be in the Brazilian Northeast. Go to João Pessoa, which is by far the best city in the Brazilian Northeast, and check out their program. Marcio is, like many of us, very cosmopolitan and world traveler. He was born in São Paulo. He was educated at the Mackenzie University in São Paulo, and he went to Barcelona for his master's and PhD. And after finishing his PhD in 2008, he got the offer to be the professor at Paraíba. And in this trajectory, in this path, Marcio became a very important reference for modern architecture in Brazil. Before he was the editor of the Journal of the Brazilian Association of Graduate Studies in Architecture. Now he's the editor of the Journal of the Brazilian Docomomo, the Foundation for the Documentation and Conservation of the Modern Movement in Brazil. He has written a lot. He has several papers in many journals, most of them in Portuguese and Spanish. We are now starting to publish together in English. And he's the editor of two books so far. One about the work of Ribas Arquitetos in Barcelona, that he published in 2008. And this beautiful book about Villanova Artigas that he published last year with Romano Guerra, the best architectural publisher in South America. I'll let the book circulate a little bit for you to see. It has a funky cover that opens up this way. But I will not talk too much about Artigas, beyond the fact that Artigas, of all the Brazilian architects that are not very well known abroad, Artigas is by far the most important. People tend to know the two Pritzker Prizers, Oscar Niemeyer and Paulo Mendes da Rocha, and you cannot understand the transition from Niemeyer to Mendes da Rocha if you don't know the work of Villanova Artigas. With that, please welcome Marcio Cotrim.
Thank you for the words, Fernando. Hello, everyone. I'm grateful for this opportunity. So I want to thank you, Professor Benedict, on behalf of the center.
Forgive me for calling you Marco.
Not for it. I would like to apologize for my bad English. I will try to speak slowly and as clearly as possible. If something doesn't make sense, please let me know, and Fernando Lara or Barbara and someone else can help me in Spanish or French or Portuguese, something like that. After, I would like to express my sadness and indignation at the political situation in Brazil right now and the arrest to the former President Lula. Villanova Artigas, the character of this presentation, in the 60s was arrested also and had his rights revoked and was expelled of the University of São Paulo. So in the 60s, during the military dictatorship. The possibility of the resurgence of this kind of perversity in Brazil is frightening. So, but this presentation is about the works of Villanova Artigas, not exactly about his political positions. One of Brazil's most celebrated architects that worked during the 20th century. Here he's together Burle Marx, one of Brazil's most important landscape architects. Both were members of Communist Party. This is probably one of the most representative buildings, the School of Architecture and Urbanism of the University of São Paulo. At that moment, it was being built, and currently. So this presentation is based on the book Villanova Artigas Casas Paulistas that Lara said about that, which I published last year by Romano Guerra Press from São Paulo. The book is about Artigas houses and it's part of my PhD dissertation defended in School of Architecture of Barcelona in 2008. Let me show you some pages of the book as examples of the kind of material that I've used and elaborated. They are sketches, drawings or redrawings, pictures, and diagrams, a lot of diagrams. To avoid boring you, I will not present exactly the same content as the book. Instead, I will present the material in different ways, using part of the main arguments. To do so, I will divide the presentation into 4 subtopics that I will show you. So first, as an introduction, let me explain that according to Bill Hiller from University of London, there are the 2 kinds of works in theory of architecture that we can be adapted to history of architecture. They are extensive studies and intensive studies. We can exemplify it with 2 early published books. The book of Jean-Louis Cohen, The Future of Architecture Since 1889, published in 2012, and the book by Joseph Ketglas, Les Heures Claires, published in 2009. On the one hand, Jean-Louis Cohen extends the period of his analysis and includes more architecture from different parts of the world in different trends with the goal of creating a more complete and more complex picture of the history of architecture of the 20th century. This building occupies a double page and was designed by Rudolf Steiner in the 20s. Is an example of this type of inclusion. On the other hand, Joseph Ketglas from the School of Architecture of Barcelona followed Le Corbusier obsessively to reconstruct all of the steps of the Villa Savoye design. Here we have all 14 studies of the Villa Savoye that Joseph Catras was truly analyzing. It's curious, to me it's curious, that that two different books with similar weight, number of pages, number of illustration, are the opposite sides of the two of many extreme poles of the history of the architecture. One discussing a house, and another one discussing the whole 20th century. I'm giving this as an introduction because in the book I have tried to follow the two paths. On the one side, an effort to construct a big picture, a kind of big explanation using other disciplines like economics or sociology. And other side, an analysis where the focus was on the building and specific matters about architecture. The idea behind this effort is that an overview is essential for shaping time and to understand something. However, it can also cause some kind of distortions like the fisheye lens, make sense? Fisheye lens, wide-angle lens. In this way, a closer look in a particular detail, closer to the theory than the history of architecture, may be able to correct some certain distortions. To try to explain this, I have organized the presentation in four short and interconnected parts. The first one is about the historiography the historiography on Villanova Artigas. The second is about the participation of the Villanova Artigas in the historiography of modern Brazilian architecture. These two initial parts are an overview to enable a more comprehensive global explanation of the phenomenon, while through the third part, the Paulista School of Architecture, I will try to problematize aspects that I will support an analysis of the architect's work. We will talk about specifically two aspects: the need to change the explanations of the phenomenon as the field of vision is expanded. In this particular case, the phenomena are the Paulista school and the brutalism and Paulista brutalism and Latin American brutalism and only brutalism. And the second aspect, as the change of analysis criteria lead to completely different results. Here I'm referring to the change from the physiognomic and material criteria towards spatial criteria of analysis. Make sense until now? The range is okay? And finally, the fourth part, the covered public square, in which he will focus on the speciality of Artigas' work, allowing, would say, new and interpretative layers represented here, in my opinion, in this eloquent image. For the first part, the historiography on Villanova Artigas, we have selected 6 points of inflection throughout the second half of the 20th century. These points correspond to 6 different publications. Lina Bobard has published in 1950 some Villanova Artigas projects, some Villanova Artigas houses. In Habitat, the magazine edited by her. Here we have some examples of this page about Villanova Artigas in the Habitat magazine. It was the first moment that the idea of a first right-hand phase was attributed to Villanova Artigas. This phase, the right-hand phase, was replaced by a Corbusian one. The second point is the publication of some Villanova Artigas projects in the book by Henrique Mindlin, Modern Architecture in Brazil, published in '56. When the Corbusian phase of Villanova Artigas' work was recognized as being nationally important. The publication number 3 was the publication by Bruno Alfieri, in the Italian journal called Zodiac in 1965. It was the first time that the Villanova Artigas works was compared with the English brutalism and recognized more for their ethical than aesthetical values, in opposition to the plasticity of Niemeyer, for example. In the end of the 60s, the Brazilian journal Acrópole published a special edition exclusively of Villanova Artigas' work. In it, the architect Fábio Penteado has written an editorial called Villanova Artigas, Builder of Schools. The editorial clearly had a double meaning. Surely it referred to the schools designed by Villanova Artigas over the past years, like this one, for example, and published in that edition, like that. This is another example of school. But in addition, it established the influence of Artigas all over the country as the leader of Paulist school. It was the first time when someone talked about the Paulist school in opposition to the Carioca school. At the same time, the Frenchman Yves Bruin was writing his PhD dissertation, published 10 years later, in 81. Bruin attributed to Villanova Artigas the role of, in his word, the role of chef de file, so the leader of the colored Polish school. Finally, in 95, 10 years after the passing of Villanova Artigas, Delina Bard and Pietro Maria, no, Delina Bo and Pietro Maria Bard Institute has published the first book about his work, consolidating a set of the most representative buildings and the image of Villanova Artigas. Here we already see at least two important things that help us to understand how the image of Villanova Artigas was created. The division of his work in three phases: Corbusian, Wrightian, and Brutalist, Wrightian, Corbusian, and Brutalist, and the idea of influence and leadership of the movement called Paulist School, linked to the third phase, the Brutalist phase. These two finds are important to understand the second part of this presentation, the role attributed to Villanova Artigas in the historiography of modern Brazilian architecture, at least in the version that prevailed practically unchallenged until the 90s. The first and most mythical was the books of the historiography of modern architecture in Brazil, was the catalog of the exhibition organized by MoMA in 43, called Brazil Buildings, Architecture New and Old, by Philip Goodwin, and with photographs by Killer Smith. The main arguments are evident in both cover and title, which would be repeated to exhaustion. The harmonious relationship between new and old, tradition and modernity, or Baroque and modernity, or modernity and place. These arguments were repeated in many of pictures published in the book, through the relationship in the urban landscapes between new and old buildings, or the solutions that intend the adapted building to the local climate, or the formalism explained since the relationship with the colonial Baroque period, or the reinterpretation of traditional solutions of the colonial period, as the painting in the tiles, or and the use of musharabis, a lattice work Arabic origin, brought to Brazil for Portuguese. Here, the musharabis. Another feature that can be attributed to the predominant historiography on modern architecture in Brazil is its division in two major phases or two schools, which the first one is more representative and mythical than the second, and the second is more durable, and it still influences contemporary architecture than the first one. Let me further detail some aspects of the first phase, called as Carioca School. Carioca refers to the people of the city of Rio de Janeiro. We can say that the Carioca School was marked by a clear association with the reformist governments, the visibility achieved by a small group of architects, a specific architectonic language, a clear beginning and a clear end, and Rio de Janeiro was the diffusion center. Let me exemplify with some images one by one. Well, here we have the building of the Ministry of Education and Health, built between 36 and 45, that became one of the symbols of the reforms by the Getúlio Vargas government. The small group of architects, especially two, Lúcio Costa, the main ideologist who informed and accompanied the authors of the book Brazil Buildings, and Oscar Niemeyer on the left, whose supposed genius would have subverted the Corbusian matrix implanted in the country from 36, when the Swiss architect was in Brazil for the second time to consult on the project of the Ministry of Education and Health. The presence of a well-defined language, which is marked by a field strategy that could be articulated in many ways, which can be exemplified by the amoeboid curve, very particular of Niemeyer works, and whose scale has been freely altered. By the butterfly wing roof, and finally by a variety of types of brise-soleil. The precise beginning and end is defined at the start by the Ministry of Education and Health, whose project was led by Lúcio Costa with consulting from Le Corbusier. And the end is Brasilia, that was designed by Lúcio Costa also. Here we can see Lúcio Costa on the right, and the President Getúlio Vargas at the moment on the left.
Juscelino Kubitschek.
Sorry, Juscelino Kubitschek. Brasilia during its construction and currently. And finally, the fact that Rio de Janeiro, the federal capital of the country until 1960, have been the diffusion center. Well, in the Brazilian architectural historiography, the Carioca School was replaced over the 50s by the second phase that I've talked before, which is called as the Paulist School. Let me some details aspects of it. There was a more evident presence of the private and industrial capital in association with the economic policies at that moment. And the city of São Paulo was its diffusion center. There was a visibly larger group of architects. Instead of the precise formal language of the Carioca School, it was marked by the use of uncoated concrete and by constructive and structural concerns. So the focus moved from the formal aspects to more technical concerns. It had an imprecise beginning that can be attributed to different buildings, as the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro, designed by Afonso Eduardo Rigi, outside São Paulo in Rio de Janeiro. And we can see the influences still today in the contemporary studios of architecture, as in this house, also in Rio de Janeiro, designed by Angelo Bucci. However, what interests us here is the fact that since the 70s, more and more importance was attributed to Villanova Artigas, in certain sense, in opposition to Oscar Niemeyer, as the result as the opposition between form and technique. It's paradoxical here that this interest in the structures increase until the technical become a formal language. A possible example of it is this building in São Paulo designed by Villanova Artigas. It's a building that supports the swimming pool of a great football team, São Paulo Football Club. It's not the best team, the best team is Corinthians. In this image, a gigantic beam, this beam, seems to be supported by only two pillars, this one and this one, another side. But in fact, 12 other pillars, like that, this one, are concealed by form and color. They are misaligned with respect to the beam painted black. You can see better here. Well, at this moment, we reach the third part of this presentation. But before, it is important to delimit two another findings that can be made at this moment. The first one is that despite the efficacy of the narrative, the opposition, the official narrative, the opposition defined by only two phases or two schools, also reduces the complexity of Brazilian architecture produced in the 20th century, leaving aside an important part of the production of that moment that didn't perfectly fit in the position formal, traditional versus technique. An example may be the modern architecture of Brazilian Northeast produced by architects such as Delfim Amorim in the city of Recife, state of Pernambuco, the same state of President Lula. The same architect, Delfim Amorim, or Diógenes Rebouças in the city of Salvador, state of Bahia, the same state of Barbara. Or the experiences prior to the Ministry of Education and Health, as the work of Gregorio Warshawskyj, the Russian Brazilian architect in the late 20s and early 30s. Or architects who in the 50s and 60s made more singular experiments, such as Sérgio Bernardes or Lina Bobardi. The second find, however, is more important. It's not more important. It's more important for this presentation. It's more important for us. It refers to the idea of the unit on which the term Paulista school or Paulista brutalism is based. In the case of the Carioca school, there was an accurate set of solutions that guaranteed the necessary unity to define it as a school. But in the case of Paulista school, the idea of a unit seems to be more associated with the use of uncoated concrete, uncoated materials, especially the concrete, and the expressiveness attributed to the structure, whose design would be more related with technical issues than formal issues. Allowing the opposition of São Paulo versus Rio de Janeiro, form versus technique, and Oscar Niemeyer versus Artigas. This unity associated with apparently a structure as opposed to the form can be explained by different ways. One of them are criticisms from abroad towards formalism attributed to Brazilian modern architecture over the 50s. However, when we extrapolate the national level for example, include Latin America and its brutalist disconnection, the explanation necessarily change. The explanation to the opposition between form versus technique is not very effective when we include Mexico and consider, for example, Canela. We could say the same about Uruguay and the Este. Putting together Mexico and Venezuela would be inevitable as an explanation for the brutalism phenomenon to talk about overcoming in the 50s of the concerns about national identity by technological and economic sovereignty. If we include Argentina, the developmentism policies at the period will have little or no relation with the overcoming of questions about national identity, especially for the Buenos Aires elites. The same could be said of Chile. In all these designs, what actually connects them is the use of concrete. However, the explanation for this phenomenon are changeable and flexible as the territorial universe of analysis is enlarged or reduced. Like the metaphor, by open and close it, the optal diaphragm that I used in the beginning of this presentation. If you consider, if we continue to include other works considering the brutalism as a global phenomenon, certainly the explanations should move outside the scope of the terms formalism, identity, tradition, or development, or developmentalism. For example, in the case of former Soviet Union, we could say that it's a kind of natural development of the Russian constructivism, for example. While in the United Kingdom, it radicalizes the ideas of modernity at the same time that criticizes it. This is an Instagram page identified as Brute Group. So what actually connects these projects? What puts them under the aegis of the term brutalism seen a global phenomenon? What put projects like these side by side on the shelves of the history of architecture? I would say, without much fear of a mistake, that are physiognomic aspects in which the concrete and coated, linked to very diverse structural strategies, assume all of the expressiveness of these buildings. From a discursive point of view, if we consider that during a good part of the 20th century, space had a central role, it is paradoxical. It's not illegitimate, but it's paradoxical that a phenomenon occur almost restricted to the physiognomic materials, apparently materiality and expressiveness. Well, here we effectively reach the last part of this presentation, in which we are interested in distrusting the units proposed as the Paulist school and reducing it, in a quantitative sense, to the phenomenon more closely related to the spaces aspects. In other words, the Paulist school as a less wide phenomenon that has been propagated, but more precise and more complex when we include aspects related to space. To illustrate this, it's necessary to look at some of houses of Villanova Artigas, still from the late 40s. The Geraldo de Stefani house, for example, occupy a traditional lot of São Paulo, which is usually narrow and long. Artigas, which is usually narrow, Artigas organized the program in 2 volumes, these ones, interconnected by ramps, and the external area, this area, are resulting for the connection. It's a kind of courtyard. Sorry. Here you can here the prototype idea is really visible when you put side by side the same solution. No? In this case, Well, however, the dimensions of this outer space result of the minimum measurements required for the correct operation of the ramp. Therefore, we can call it as a kind of residual court art. That is, the special residues of this decisions linked to the organization of the program. We can see other similar cases in Artigas' work, like these three houses, which we can also call as residual courtyards. The decisive transformation of this space, this kind of residual courtyard, occurs at Casa Betega House, in Curitiba, outside of São Paulo. In this case, in the Betega House, Artigas incorporated what we defined as a residual courtyard into the interior of the house. Now, it becomes a great protagonist space, a kind of atrium, not more a residual courtyard. Looking at the section, you can see a single flat slab sheltering the interior spaces. In the section is decisive to understand these projects and their transformation, as we will see. However, in the case of Betega House, this occurs with a traditional structural system of slabs, beams, and pillars. The double height ceilings and the ramp combined to create the most important space in the house is not new. Le Corbusier had tested something similar in several projects, such as La Maison La Roche, built in between 23 and 25. But even Brazilian architects such as Niemeyer, who is he in this picture, or Acácio Borsoi, or Sérgio Bernardes had also done similar experiments. It was in the Olga Baeta's house and Mario Tax Bittencourt house where Villanova Artigas seems to have given the most important turn in his work. In the first one, he used a type of portico in which a huge beam, this is a beam, support two apparently misplaced pillars. This one and this, another one. These two porticos, there are one here and another one on back, support a single slab that bends over the two sides, sheltering the entire program and arranging on different levels. You can see better in this section. Or in this internal view. In Mario Tax Bittencourt house, the portico is now defined by two large beams wall. You can see better here. That touch the ground only in 2 points, this point and this point, defining the volumetric and structural set. Here we can see one of the points touching the ground. Inside the space, the ramps and the courtyard reappear without obstacles. This solution led to an expressive set of houses. Some examples. Houses that we can use the same description. Large flat slab, sheltering the whole program, organizing in different intermediate levels in which the structure is peripheral. Peripheral exists this word. Mm-hmm. Well, this is very different design strategy from some Brazilian architects who are often presented as part of the Paulista school or Paulista brutalism. This house was designed by Joaquim Guedes, in São Paulo, and in the same neighborhood, another house designed by Carlos Milan. This fact put in evidence the importance of the section as a way of analysis to understand importance difference between these projects, which in the case of Artigas allows visualizing the continuity between the exterior and the interior, which extended through the ramps for other floors. A strategy completely different that we can see in this first session related to this picture. Here we have another example of discontinuity that extends through the ramp to other floors. In this case, the section is of a bus station designed by Artigas, where through the discontinuity, someone can use the building to across the different level of the city. Two different levels of the city. You can use the building to it. This is a clear urban dimension in this attitude, whose transition between public and private realms take a place in a more direct way. But there is also a political dimension in this action, in which the importance given to the collective space is larger than intimate spaces. So Artigas houses served as labs for projects with more complex programs, such as social clubs, garage for boats, and schools, many schools, on which the School of Architecture of São Paulo, of the University of São Paulo, is surely the most important. All of these projects can be described in much the same way. A large slab under which the entire program, whatever it is organized at different intermediate levels, most of the time by ramps, defining major space such as a kind of public space. It is this generalization that, in my opinion, makes the solution so attractive. That is ability to suit any or almost any program. We can see that same logic in the work of a more restricted group of architects as Paulo Bastos, Rui Otaki, Paulo Mendes da Rocha, or Paulo Zimbres, whose the relationship with Villanova Artigas was more direct. This is a school, a house, this is a beach house, this is a urban house, like a museum and a cultural center, schools, another schools, a club, a social club, the same, a bank, a factory building. Well, according to my interpretation, these architects are a more cohesive group whose spatial, plastic, and structural relations are inseparable. This interpretation is also not restricted to the Brazilian scope, allowing more precise connections both in Latin America and in the rest of the continents. This is the School of Engineering of Barranco, Peru. One cemetery in Uruguay, Montevideo. Is it Montevideo?
Bayardo.
The School of Architecture of Buenos Aires and the Bank of London in Buenos Aires. In this sense, we can move more freely in the history and the theory of architecture. Or we can make to appear other characters that initially were left out the Brazilian historiography version, like the case study house, like the architects that program case study house, or Louis Kahn. This is an example of Louis Kahn. It's a parasol house, and Mies. Probably the comparison between the work of Mies and the work of Artigas is the most fruitful. The comparison denotes the importance of the space rather the material used. Mies used the most of the time metallic structures, and while Artigas used the concrete. However, they result in comparable buildings. That is the projects defined by a flat slab that house the whole program, whose peripheral structure release all interior space from any interference, and whose expressiveness is attributed to the structural set. However, its a fundamental difference helps us understand both architects. On the one hand, for me, the dialogue between the city and buildings as the Barcelona Pavilion, the Farnes Wharf, the Crow Hall, or the Bacardi offices occurs almost always in a way mediated by a platform, a kind of podium, as in a Greek temple, for say something. One realizes that we are inside when we go up the stairs. A strategy that allows me to hide the unwanted part of the program. You can see here, for example, leaving the man space. On the other hand, in a very different way, Artigas proposed a more frank relationship between interior and exterior, or even ideally city and the buildings. Only the shade that changes over the course of the day marks the transition. In some case, such as in a public square, but covered. The initial idea was finished with this, in my opinion, eloquent image, but then I remember the work of a friend, a visual artist, a woman, that fusing both projects. So it seems to me more adequate to finish it with this image. Thank you very much. I don't know the music.
Well, as ever, floor is open to questions. If we could stay in place till 1, that would be great. I'll definitely stop at 1.
Marcio, in our current research, we are working on hybrid buildings, hybrid programs in Latin America in the 1950s and 60s to try to problematize the way that what I call NATO historiography of the North Atlantic, has worked on those issues. The hybrid programs almost disappeared from the history of architecture in the late 20th century, and we are arguing that it continues in Latin America and evolved. So, in the same sense, how do you think that Artigas architecture problematizes the NATO narrative of late 20th century brutalism, this whole late modern movement of the 1950s and 60s? What would change in the books by Frampton or Jean-Louis Cohen if they analyze Artigas the way you did?
I don't know. Probably, if we include the space as an overlap with the material and with the concrete as a criteria, we can include other characters, other possibilities to link it, and it is, in my opinion, important to redesign the history of all of the time. But in the case of Artigas, it's important to understand his political position to understand his architecture. So only change the criteria of analysis and put the space is not enough. We need to talk in another level and talk about the relations between his architecture and his political positions. No, is in my opinion the possibility to understand this kind of connection with the space, the importance of the collective space,
The covered public
the
square.
covered public square in the end. Sense?
Was there any influence by Louis Kahn on South American architecture? Since he worked in concrete, he often did heroic structure. But it seems that there was something different at work
Yeah,
for him than for.
yeah. Louis Kahn was left aside of the history of Brazilian architecture, and I think if you use, for example, the idea of big cover, it's more fruitful. In this case, for example, I'm sorry, this is near here. The parasol house of Kahn is a kind of possibility to connection with the work of Paulista School.
I think Louis Kahn showed up in Brazil in the early 70s.
Yeah,
In the early 60s, mid 60s, I find no trace of anybody talking about Louis Kahn yet. Then in the late 60s, early 70s, then Louis Kahn lands
as a postmodern.
as a postmodern, as a late modern,
Yeah.
somebody that was working with meaning and subjectivity.
Because he's often lumped in with brutalists. Because,
Yeah.
But then he was
work in
extremely
Dakar
influential.
and so
The whole postmodern Brazilian school of the mid 70s and early 80s was very Kahn, very, very. Look at Ello Maia, you look at Ryotaki, even in Bogota, what Rogério Salmona was doing in Colombia, there's a lot of Kahn in his the square and the circle and the cylinder.
Right.
And the brick, in my
The
opinion,
brick,
is the reason
and the
that-
brick,
that this,
the expression of the materiality. I think there's a delay there that Louis Kahn, they did not pay attention on Louis Kahn in the 60s.
Yeah.
But they didn't pay attention to him here either in the 60s. So.
it's true.
So, yeah.
I've got a question. What's the public opinion of these buildings now? And not just among maybe the public, but also among
By
younger
architects? By architects or
Well, the people who are maybe inhabiting like the bus station, but also by younger architects.
well, about the bus station, for example, there is a doc about Villanova Artigas that's so beautiful because the people that use the building talk about the possibility to cross the different levels, and they don't talk about the materiality or the aesthetic questions, aesthetic matters, but the use it's so important for the people. For example, in the case of bus station, I recommend
They like the
this
ramps
building.
or they don't like the
Yeah,
ramps?
they like the
They
ramps.
like the ramps.
What about younger architects?
Uh,
Maybe the
they,
ones inhabiting the school of architecture.
he's really important until now. Really important.
And
Really important.
the most celebrated young architects now there, like Angelo Bucci, are direct descendants of
Connection,
Artigas.
yeah.
Sure,
Because
the hovering masses.
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
big
If you
ramps
look at
and the-
Bucci's, Puntoni,
Yeah.
all the
This house.
great young
It's
architects
from
there
Angelo Bucci in the 20s.
around their 50s, and yeah, it's a direct connection to Artigas.
His
Through
house is in
Mendes de Rocha.
2010.
Through Mendes da Rocha, yeah.
I also know because Paulo Mendes da Rocha is a contemporary.
Of Artigas,
Artigas, yes.
10 years younger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For a younger architect, is the same.
Yeah.
Same age.
Yeah, they all blend together.
Yeah. But Bucci, no, Bucci is a young architect, and this house was built in 2011 or 2012. I don't know exactly. And you can describe in the same way the two porticos with one only slab, the different levels inside.
If you read Bucci's PhD dissertation that the center published a few years ago, it's all there. I mean, the explanation for everything is there on Boches.
In São Paulo, at the School of Architecture, Artigas is like a myth. You cannot speak bad about him. It's a problem.
Here you can.
Yes.
Marcio, I have a question. You were saying the difference between the Cariocan school and the Sao Paulo school was very much related to the issue of space and structure. But when you see the images in the Paulista school, also the space is very important. It's very there is much of plasticity in designing spaces through the structure, through the technique. So to what extent does this difference actually is true between, so trying to make the difference between the two schools based on these criteria?
Really good question, because I completely agree with you. But is a narrative. That was the narrative defined by the historiography on the 20th century.
Okay.
I put this image, because in my opinion it's really ambiguous image. For one hand, we can exemplify the different narratives, one linked to the form and another one linked to the structural or materiality, but both are the same logical.
And they were designed very closely in time. I mean, if you go back to the Regis Museum.
I don't remember.
So I think, so to me, this is the missing link. This is 1953, and it's Afonso Reigi who had worked with Lúcio Costa and Corbusier on the Ministry of Education, had done the Pedregulho housing complex, and then when he did the museum, he was doing it this way in 1953. In 53, Artigas was shifting from Corbusian to brutalism also at the same time.
Between the two houses. That
and then now go back to Obama and the FAO. So the Alvorada Palace, where you see Obama and Dilma,
He seems happy.
Yeah,
Must be the architect.
happier than her.
Yeah.
This was designed by Niemeyer, first sketches in 1957, and the final project 1958-59. And the School of Architecture, the design started in 1961, the first sketches. So they are all moving in that direction, but the way we talk about them have not moved. The way we talk about them, we split them.
So what you're saying is that the narrative doesn't work. That in real they are part all of the same process, and with just different expressions through Lucio Costa and Niemeyer on the one hand, and Artigas and Mendes da Rocha on the other side. Or how do you see
works until the 80s.
Okay.
When the Brazilian university study more deeply our architecture, the contradictions appear, and in my opinion, it's important that the ambiguities and contradictions appear, to construct the field of history of architecture. We had only one narrative, one version that during for 40 years as an axiom.
Yeah.
I don't know if exists this word.
I think for me it was very interesting when you started the extensive intensive distinction. But it seems to me that those are infinitely long in both directions.
Yes.
That is that you prose two books, right? But actually, it seems like you could keep becoming more intensive. You could probably write a book about one room, one ramp, one piece of, you know what I'm saying? Like, where does that end? Certainly the other way, one can write ever larger narratives including gigantic slices of history in a few paragraphs each, and so forth. So do you think the field has settled into what counts as an extensive, like you can take a century or you can take a house? That's it. You can't go smaller than a house, you can't go longer than a century.
The house.
The house is the smallest unit of architectural critique.
Is, in my opinion, it's closer than our field as architects. And as 20th century, it's closer than a historian field. Of course, it's important, the overlap of these and the connection, but they are two fields.
I'm going to have to close. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marcio.